Hello and welcome to episode 4 of my mostly stock career. Now, today we're starting here in the mission control building because we're going to grab a couple of contracts. Although we're going to be completing the one we grabbed last time, which involved flying around Kerbin. So the first one we're going to grab is Orbit the Moon, because we do plan to orbit the Moon. We might start that launch, although I don't know how far we're going to be getting into it just yet. But we'll see how long this flight mission takes. Next thing we're going to do is when we go to the moon, we're going to be able to grab science data from Kerbin. So we're going to snag this one. And I believe that that is all we're actually going to be grabbing, because the rest is ferry tourists, test some engines that are not efficient, such as the Poodle is really bad to test at the launch site. It's a much better in-space engine. And then there's just more rescuing, which I think we've rescued enough for now, since we did get 3 engineers last time. So what we're going to be doing is perform visual surveys of Kerbin. Now, take an EVA report on the surface at 2 places, and take a crew report in flight below 17,800 meters and 18,700 meters at 2 different places. What this means is I think a parachute, or not a parachute, but a plane with maybe parachutes would be better. I don't think we need parachutes if we can actually land it properly, but we'll probably put them on as a safety precaution, although we don't want to have to use them. But I think a plane would be a very good thing to actually get this done. So to get started, we're actually going to grab some of these liquid fuel oxidizer tanks. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the only liquid fuel tanks, so we do have to use the liquid fuel and oxidizer. However, we can right-click the part and just get rid of all the oxidizer, so we're not really wasting too much space with it. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab 2 of these, and in the front one, I'm going to lock it. This is simply going to make it so that my mass is centered a little more forward, which is helpful when actually making planes, because when your mass is forward, generally you're more stable. And the reason for that is when you start putting on wings. Now, with space planes, there's something you need to know about building it. And it's you need to both know where the center of mass is and where the center of lift is, because this is very important. In order for a space plane to be stable, its center of lift needs to be behind the center of mass. So this current setup, the space plane is very unstable, or just the airplane for this one. Now if we were to move these wings back here, it would be stable, because now the center of lift is behind the center of mass. However, we're going to put these wings up front, and we're actually going to be using those tail fins that I've used quite a bit and like so much, and we're going to be putting these on the back. Now the tail fins by themselves provide us quite a bit of lift. And of course we're going to be putting it in a simple just try pattern where there's 3 of them, 2 on the sides and 1 on top. Now the reason for this is because it gives us lots of control. What the 2 on the bottom, or on the sides here, are going to do is they're going to give us both yaw control, and then or pitch control I should say, because we can pitch up and down. The rudder, basically the tail fin on the actual tail, is going to give us yaw control, so we can have a little bit of left and right movement. And then of course roll is going to come pretty much primarily from the cockpit. However, these 2 the 2 tail fins on the bottom backside can invert. So say this one points down and this one points up to give us roll as well, which means we have plenty of stability. Now for this, we're going to use the only jet engine we have, which is the basic jet engine. No turbojet just yet, even though it's so much fun. How it actually increases its thrust the faster you go, which allows you to go very quickly at very low altitudes. And now, because our center of lift has actually shifted forward a little bit, or our center of mass is shifted back because we added the engine, we're just going to move these wings back a little bit, as to make it so that our center of lift is behind our center of mass. And of course, along with this, we need a couple wheels. So hopefully that we can land. We'll have to see about the landing depending on what the places look like, but I am going to put some parachutes on, just to make it in case I need to use them instead to land. Now we can just speed along the rest of the construction because it's not too eventful. I just add wheels and a bunch of utilities like science experiments and parachutes as to kind of prepare for any situation on what might happen with the plane. Now I'm putting the parachutes on the dorsal side, as you can see, because I want the parachutes to deploy and force the aircraft to land on its wheels. That way we can have the chance of taking off again without losing any parts. I also put on thermometers along with an antenna, and eventually a couple barometers just so I can take lots of science along the way. So this is a little bit on spaceplane construction. I was going to go, or not spaceplane, but regular plane construction. I was going to go over how to fly it to some extent. However, some unforeseen things happened with the actual plane. So before launching the plane, I did make a couple of changes where I added a ladder on the side so that Jebediah could jump back into the plane. Because while I was flying it for the first kind of test run to make sure the thing worked, I noticed he couldn't get out. So I target the locations that we're going to be going to and take off. It's a pretty rough takeoff because the runway is very unsmooth. It's basically made of a bunch of dirt piled on an area, and of course it will get better as we upgrade it. But basically this is a very long flight. So let's skip ahead to the interesting stuff. Now first, as I'm flying over the mountains, actually approaching my first target, once we get about there, we get a nice message saying we've entered the first area, Scott's Folly. So we of course take our crew report, and then proceed to move on to the two sites that we actually need to land at. Now, to land at these sites, I wasn't quite expecting the terrain that just happens to be about them, or they just happen to be over. So as you can see, as I'm flying over here, I'm trying to figure out where exactly these are. And then I get the message that tells me they're basically right on this ridge. So in just a second you will see you are now entering Valentina's Dune Beta, which is this mountain ridge, which I was not expecting in the slightest to be where I would have to land. So what I decide to do is I can just land on this kind of flat area right up here using the parachutes, and then I can take Jebediah, who is our pilot, and bring him down the ridge, just walk him down there so that he can take the surface samples, or take the surface EVA report. So I just use the parachutes, and they do keep my craft mostly upright, although it's a little emphasis on the back because I did use 2 parachutes. However, they do safely bring me down. And then after a little bit of walking, something happens. Did my plane just explode? What? How did that happen? What? What would compel my plane to explode? And as my old self was trying to figure out what exactly had happened, I concluded that after about a few minutes, or the duration of really walking around, which has been sped up, that what happened was the plane basically was being affected by physics warp and it somehow clipped through the ground or something, which caused it to explode. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe if you leave the jet engines on when it's parked instead of actually right-clicking and deactivating them, what happens is possibly the engine explodes or overheats and explodes. That's one solution. But really, I'm not entirely sure. Anyhow, I do take Jebediah and I do run him around the area trying to figure out where the second location is, and I ultimately end up being able to get both of the surface EVA reports before recovering Jebediah and leaving only the last area to grab in flight, and I'll probably do that when I return from the moon. Okay, so I want to talk about the design of this vessel here, really quick. Now, when you build a vessel, it's really good to actually build it in reverse. And what I mean by this is don't look at it as in thinking about how am I going to get it first into orbit, but thinking about the last thing you're going to do. Now, this vessel is designed to land on the moon, meaning the last thing that it's going to do is return. So returning is going to take about 600 delta V to get back from the moon. And what it's going to take is about another 200 to 300 to get us from the moon's orbit back to Kerbin. So that's about 900 delta V. We're going to play it safe and say we have 1000 delta V for that room for error, basically. So since it takes 1000 delta V to return from landed on the moon, we have 2200 delta V to land on the moon. Now, since a lunar orbit is about 600 delta V, then it's going to take us, let's just tack on about 200, say we do a pretty efficient landing. Then it's going to take us, say, 800 delta V to land, which leaves us with 1600 delta V to play with. Now I know it's going to take us a couple hundred delta V to slow down, which we'll just say 200. It probably will be maybe a little more, depending on our encounter, to actually get caught by the moon, which would bring us down to 1400 delta V. Now, we know it takes about 800 to 900 delta V just to encounter the moon, which brings us down to 300. So, 3000 delta V from Kerbin's orbit into a lunar orbit, into a lunar landing, into a return is about how much delta V you need. So if you have Kerbal Engineer, you can just check and see that 3000 is enough. We're going to use 3200 because, of course, it gives us room for error. And I always like having extra delta V just in case something goes unplanned or unpredictable. Now, of course, in the bottom two stages, we have 4200 meters per second of delta V, which is more than enough to get us into orbit. So, because we're able to get into orbit, we guarantee ourselves with the first two stages we get into orbit, and then we guarantee ourselves that we'll have plenty of delta V for this landing. So, first, lunar lander. And to this, we're not going to bring Jebediah. He was just on a plane and did a lot of running, so he is quite tired. Instead, Valentina is going to have the honor for the first lunar landing. And the reason I like to bring pilots is because pilots give us SAS. Stability, which currently a pilot is the only means that we have unlocked. We can unlock some tech that will get us it, but currently the pilot is the only one. So, how about we launch this? Of course, we're employing the same asparagus staging tactic that we used in the rescue launch, as well as pretty much the exact same rescue launch stage for the upper stage. Now, we're only going to plan to get into lunar orbit. We're going to be doing the landing probably next time since we've spent a lot of time on this already. Although, that post-editing guy, the guy that does all the actual editing of the footage and the post-commentary, well, he's going to be the one to ultimately decide whether or not we land on the moon or not. However, just my prediction is that we've currently used too much time. So after that wonderful conversation with myself, we actually are going to speed up the video and take this rocket up to orbit. Now, as something, if you had been watching any of my previous series that I did, you're going to notice something very signature happen, which is the rocket loses control. Now this is because I did not put any tail fins on because, well, I forgot them, to basically keep it simple. Now, if you ever have a problem with a rocket rolling over like that while you're trying to launch it into orbit, it's probably because you don't have any tail fins, or basically you don't have enough control authority. You can make up for that control authority with either tail fins, or using a lot of SAS, which will give you extra torque from the command modules that will be able to hold your craft in place without actually losing control of it, which is what happened when I flipped around. So you just need more control authority if you have problems with stability on launching your rockets. There we go, we've gotten our successful orbit. Now we just have to find the moon, and the moon is right there, which means because we know that the moon, basically we burn when we're facing straight at it, all we have to do is line the moon up with Kerbin, pick the bottom side. Of course, last time I said it like this, where you put the moon on the right and you pick the bottom orbit, but you can always just line the moon up, make sure you're on the orbit of the way you're going, which, because we're going anti-clockwise, meaning we're going in this direction with the mouse, Then when we move from here into here, we're going to move, again, even further out, because that's where we're going to burn, and we will snag our encounter. Now, we're not going to land on the moon, we are going for an orbit, first off. It is more efficient to, of course, if you can, have your encounter slam yourself. As you see, we have no periapsis, so having the encounter slam ourselves directly into the moon is more efficient than actually getting the orbit first. However, we have a contract that says we need an orbit, so an orbit we shall get. There we go, this will be fine. 862 meters per second worth of delta V. We didn't fully use our launch stage. We have a extremely small amount of liquid fuel left. Probably be about 50 delta V, maybe, if that, probably much less. I'm not too sure. If I had Flight Engineer active, then I could actually check that way. But, just like last time, we're going to go into the moon, and we're going to be doing a flyby, but we're going to actually catch ourselves on the moon this time. So instead of just letting ourselves fly by the moon, we're going to slow ourselves down so that the moon takes control of our orbit. Now, since I know I have a 2.0 thrust-to-weight ratio on the Poodle engine, pretty much this means that my burn time is going to be the same for both this upper engine and my next staged engine, the Poodle. So I'm not too worried about the estimated burn time. I'm pretty sure it's going to be quite accurate. So we'll just face the node and burn. There we go, stage that and burn. And the estimated burn time did shoot up a little bit. However, it won't be a problem. We have overbuilt the craft, as I always like to do, so that we can make mistakes like this without having to be like, oh no, I messed up one small burn. That now means I'm forced to, I don't know, restart the launch because I can't actually get to my target. So there we go. Maneuver node is done. We should have our encounter. The game is still a little confused as to if we're going to encounter it or not, I guess, but it'll solve itself out when we actually get into the when we switch sphere of influences. Now, because I had Flight Engineer, even though I don't have it now, I know this stage has 3200 delta V. Now, just knowing that it's 3200 delta V and roughly looking at my fuel tank, I'm roughly at 2/3 full. So I still have about 2000 delta V that I can play around with, just, roughly looking at this. I could actually really take the numbers and calculate it because I do have the max fuel and the current fuel, which would be a ratio times 3200, but I should be fine the way it is, the way I am. So let's just do our time acceleration. Until, of course, we get to the moon. And of course the patched conics are still a little confused as to what's happening right now. Probably because we're barely encountering the moon. But it should sort itself out once we hit this right here. There we go. Now it's sorted itself out. Now, last time we flew by the moon, all we did was we time warped until we got low, we took our scientific data, and then we let ourselves fly back into this returned orbit that we manipulated. This time, all we're going to do is, if you see our periapsis here, all we need to do is click close to our periapsis, add a maneuver, and basically say slow down. Now, because we slow down, what happens is the moon's gravity well, its field of gravity, will actually catch us. And because we're moving slower, we'll actually orbit the moon versus just flying by it. So instead of flying by it moving really fast, we'll slow ourselves down quite significantly to the point we actually orbit it. Because of course its gravity pulls us in towards it. So if you actually watched, you can see that if we go back to the moment on the maneuver node lines, you can see as we slow down, we curve in toward the moon more, because of course the moon's gravity is slowly pulling us toward it. And then of course once we get to that point where it's pulled us at the maximum, then we start coming back into the moon. So of course we're just going to edit this maneuver node until they're both at about kinda the same. And that should be fine. We don't need it to be perfect since we do plan to land anyway. So now we're just going to face our node and wait until we get to it. Now I do want to say that this is the node that you would want to do any of your orbital editing. So if, say, we needed to change our plane to align it with another orbit, this is the point, this would be the last chance to really do it efficiently. Now, of course, it would be more efficient to do it when we're still over at Kerbin because just the way distance affects how much efficiency you get out of your fuel. I believe it's called the Oberth effect. Basically, it states that the kinetic energy that is contained within your fuel, meaning the faster you're moving, the more kinetic energy your fuel has. When you burn the fuel, since it already has that kinetic energy, you use that kinetic energy up. So if you're moving faster, you have more kinetic energy. So when you burn the fuel, you're able to utilize that kinetic energy stored within the fuel. It says something like that. I'm not a physicist, so I'm not 100% certain, but I believe that's the general idea of it. Basically, it means the faster you're moving, the more efficient your fuel is, or the more you'll get out of your fuel. So we're just going to move up on this maneuver node and burn the 9-second burn about halfway through and get captured by the moon in a nice orbit. And we also completed the contract for orbiting the moon, so we did part 1 of our landing. We're actually going to open this up and do some of the experiments that we didn't have last time. So we did have temperature. I guess I was wrong on that. We did have temperature last time. However, I know we don't have pressure data. So we'll do one of the pressure data high over the moon. We'll see if we can snag a low over the moon later. But we'll be fine with what we have right now. And now all that's left to do is land, which unfortunately I believe we're going to have to do next time. So I thank you guys all for watching. This is PTT GRW, signing out.